Well, good afternoon and welcome to our second panel in this symposium on Red and Blue America, the political map of the new century. My name is Don Wolfensberger. I am director of the Congress Project here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and your moderator today. I was persuaded by some of my colleagues here at the center to wear my red and blue tie that the stripes are of equal width, I'm told, so I'm going to be a neutral moderator, and even Mark Kirk wore his red and blue tie, but I'm familiar with his district north of Chicago there. He appeals to a lot of folks in the middle. Our panel this afternoon is entitled Congress in the Balance, Politics, Policies, and the Midterm Elections. But whereas our previous panel concentrated a great deal on sort of the demographics of the electoral map, we're going to look a little bit more at the nexus between policy issues and the upcoming midterm elections. As you may have heard from our first panel, in about 7 months, on November 7th, where the Americans will go to the polls and pick all 435 members of the House of Representatives, one-third of the Senate, 33 seats there. I think some 36 governorships are also up this fall. And I sense from my visits to the Hill that there is a great deal of, shall we say, tension, nervousness, anxiety, anticipation, depending on who you talk to, which party, about this upcoming election, because I think a lot of people feel that maybe for the first time in quite a few years, things are within reach for the Democrats to retake control of at least the House, if not the Senate as well. The poll numbers are quite interesting, and not only is President Bush coming in at about a 39% approval rating according to the Time magazine poll taken last week. The Congress's approval rating is down around 39%, and also the same poll showed that Republicans, Democrats score about the same, about 39%. And when the Americans were polled in the generic poll who they'd vote for a member of Congress, the Democrats had about 11% edge there, I think about 49 to 38%. Those generic polls, of course, are very deceptive, because the other thing that was shown in this Time magazine poll was that 63% of the American people approve of the job that their member of Congress is doing. So I don't think you can necessarily say that there is an anti-incumbent mood running at this point in the country, but it's very difficult to tell, and things certainly are hanging in the balance, as the title of our panel would indicate. I am old enough to remember when the red and blue designations meant just the opposite of what they do today, and I think that was brought out a little bit in the first panel, where Republicans were represented by blue on those political maps and Democrats by red. And I think that the way the current designation came about was just the graphics department, one of the networks, making a switch, and others then following suit. But I was thinking about it because somebody mentioned that red is, associated with communism, or at least with revolutionaries, blue with aristocracy and monarchy and so on. But then when I thought about what's happened in the last 20 years or so in Republican politics, you had Richard Nixon, or the last 40 years, claiming the new American Revolution. You had the Reagan Revolution, the Gingrich Revolution. So Republicans tend to embrace revolutionary more than maybe the Democrats do. So maybe red is appropriate now. We are very fortunate to have with us a very distinguished panel today of three people from two alums of Cornell, as well as a distinguished professor from Cornell, and then there's Gene Cummings and myself, neither of us from Cornell, but we will briefly introduce each of them. Their full biographies are in your handouts, but I will introduce them now in the order in which they will appear, so that I will not interrupt the flow of their presentations, and they are free to either speak from their places at the table or to use the lectern, so it's their choice. And I've asked each of the members of Congress to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then our other two folks to speak from 10 to 15 minutes. Professor Silby informed me that no professor speaks for only 10 minutes, so we will give him the full 15 minutes.
That's right.
We just hope he'll forego his 40-minute lecture today. Congressman Mark Kirk represents the 5th Congressional District, is that, or 10th, I'm sorry, 10th Congressional District on the North Shore of Chicago. get this right, which runs, I think, from Waukegan to Wilmette. He got his start on the Hill, much as I did, as working for his own member of Congress, John Porter, who Mark then succeeded when Congressman Porter retired. But in between then, he also worked at the State Department, at the World Bank, with a law firm. So he's had a very varied career, in addition to which he is a naval intelligence officer in the Reserve. So he's done several, I think 4 tours of duty at sea and about 3 in Panama. So he has had quite an experience. He graduated from Cornell in 1981. He got his M.A. At the London School of Economics, I believe, and his law degree from Georgetown University. He currently is a member of the very prestigious House Appropriations Committee, the committee that has the money. And when somebody asked him to explain how it was that he got on such a prestigious committee, he's only a third termer, and I think he went on in his second term, is that correct? He said 3 words, J. Dennis Hastert. And it helps to have a speaker from the same state that you're from. And Mr. Hastert was very good in helping to place Mark on that committee, along with the rest of the folks on the Committee on Committees. Our second speaker today will be Congressman Bob Filner, who represents, I believe, the 51st District of California, which is in the San Diego area, and it's on the California border, actually. He got his start as a teacher. I believe was it political science or the history of science? History of science. And so he's been a teacher. He worked on the Hill for 2 very distinguished Minnesotans, Congressman Don Fraser and then Senator Hubert Humphrey. And he was also a freedom rider in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement in the South, and I spent a little time in a Mississippi jail, as I think I have read somewhere. But he is in his 7th term, first elected in 1992. He serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Veterans Committee in the House. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the year of your graduation from.
I don't remember it, so I. What should you?
I think it was it 19.
BA in '63 and PhD in '70.
Okay, that's right, and PhD in political and history of science from Rutgers. Okay, our third speaker. Cornell.
I am a Cornellian through and through.
The PhD was Cornell too. Okay, Professor Joel Silby is the President White Professor of History Emeritus at Cornell, where he taught from 1966 until his retirement in 2002. His area of specialty is American history in the pre-Civil War era, political history in particular, and he's written numerous books. I think the most notable ones are one on the Democratic Party in the Civil War era and another one on Martin Van Buren and the emergence of American politics. And he is a former director of the Cornell in Washington program. And for those of you who are just joining us this afternoon for the first time, today we are co-hosting this program with Cornell and commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Cornell in Washington program. So we want to welcome all the alumni from Cornell that are here, as well as our regular public audience that comes to our programs. Jean Cummings is a political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where she covers the White House beat. She previously covered the Congress during the Gingrich era, and that's when I first met her when I served on the House Rules Committee up there in the Capitol. She won a National Press Club Award for her reporting on the Gingrich ethics problems, and she subsequently won the Aldo Beckman Award for her coverage of the Clinton White House. She's a graduate of the University of Maryland, where she earned a BA in journalism with a minor in political science. That'll be the order of our speakers. When they each have finished talking, we'll mix it up a little among the panel and then open it up to our audience. And you're reminded that there will be a reception following this program across the hall in the Daniel Patrick Moynihan boardroom. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Congressman Mark Kirk.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Don. We worked together when he worked for Chairman Jerry Solomon on the Rules Committee for many years. Very good service. For me, I come to you as Cornell Class 81, and I want to give a shout-out to 2 of my fraternity brothers here, Gilgore Taskovich and Umair Khan, both of Seal and Serpent, the Animal House of Thurston Avenue. And so also want to really thank Bob Filner for being here. When I was a staffer, I staffed Bob on a CODEL, throughout the Middle East, and he still treats me as a staffer to this day. I come, we have really reflecting, I think, the Cornell reality. I think last year I was the center of the House. My voting record was in the exact middle of the House of Representatives, and reflects, I think, my chairmanship of the Tuesday group, which is the group of now 45 Republican moderates in the House. Bob had a distinction for being on one wing. I'll have you guess which side he was. And we don't have any Cornellian vast right-wingers here, which I think does reflect our school's viewpoint from the middle and to the left. And what I want to do is talk about where I think the Congress should go and where we should be working, because I think there is a broad and bipartisan consensus on the need for a reform of the Congress itself and of the work plan coming up. We were just, Don and I were just in the Rules Committee yesterday reviewing a 3-hour hearing on the need for all the ethics rules changes that need to be upgraded. Each generation goes through this process, and this is clearly the year and the generation for a dramatic upgrade in the congressional ethics rules of the Congress. For us, I'm very proud that, for example, we're finally going to go enact the reforms that have been the law of the land in my state of Illinois since my predecessor, John Porter, got them enacted as a state representative, of canceling the pension of a member of Congress convicted of a felony. And I think that is a well-needed reform. The only problem is, as I testified yesterday, that the current bill that's being considered only identifies 3 felonies, whereas the legislation that we considered in 1996 overwhelmingly passed with Speaker Hastert's vote, with Minority Leaders Pelosi's vote, identified 25 felonies that you could lose your pension for. And so one of the things that I'll be doing when we take up the bill is to load the other 22 felonies back in to the bill, including wire fraud and tax evasion, to set a clear signal that if you are convicted of a felony as a member of Congress, goodbye to your pension. I think it's especially appropriate reform because it falls heaviest on senior members who run the institution. Senior members are chairmen, senior members are ranking minority members. They're the ones who serve the longest, and they're the ones who have the pensions. And I think in some ways this reform also sets up a very good dynamic that congressional spouses will turn into ethics police. Because if they see something going on, they'll realize this is threatening their long-term income, and they will help. The most important thing is not that we punish felonies, is that felonies never occur, and that especially lawmakers adhere to not just the letter of the law, but also the spirit. One other reform, and I'm going to be, in the typical moderate Republican Tuesday group fashion, I'm going to be very bipartisan here. One other reform that I'm backing is from Congresswoman Louise Slaughter, who has identified a key loophole that members of the executive branch that in their jobs learn of inside information are prohibited from trading on that inside information in the stock market. A similar prohibition does not apply to members of Congress and their staff, in which there is obviously a lot of information not readily available to a retiree in Deerfield, Illinois, investing their IRA in the stock market. And so Louise has identified a key reform to close that loophole and prevent any leadership staff, any congressional staff, any member of Congress from using information not readily and publicly available to trade in a stock. And I think that's a needed reform. Beyond fixing the Congress, though, I think we need to look at the country in a new way and lay out a new work plan. And that is to see the country not as it was, but as it is in this way. We used to think of the United States as 1/3 rural, 1/3 suburban, and 1/3 urban, and break out the votes in that way, with the rural vote clearly going decisively Republican, and the urban vote clearly going decisively Democrat. And those two factoids are true. But what is outdated about that view is that we all know the rural vote has collapsed a long time ago. Only about 16% of Americans vote from rural communities. What is not well understood is the urban vote has also collapsed. Only about 13% of voters in the last election were from major urban centers. And while they reliably vote Democratic, they are just less of a part of the national voting picture than they ever have been. One face of the 21st century for our country is the domination of the suburbs in the political life of the United States. The 2004 election was the first election in our country's history in which over half of voters were suburban. And this is a vote which went by 1 percentage point for the president, but is in the balance and controls the destiny not just of the presidency, but of the Congress. When you look at suburban families and you ask them what are their top priorities, for the last 20 years they have consistently told us what their top priorities are, which is action by the Congress in appropriate ways on health care reform, on education, on conservation, and on the economy. And so what I have been doing, built from the Republican moderate base, but then reaching out to various parts of the Congress, is building a suburban agenda work plan for the Congress. Things like extending COBRA health insurance benefits for life. If you're a retiree and you lose your health insurance under COBRA, you already can keep your insurance benefits for life. But if you're not a retiree and you're just laid off, those rights run out after 18 months. But the average American in the 21st century will have 5 jobs. And we should take action to make sure that you have a safe place for your family insurance forever. Another reform that we would like, especially in the suburbs, is preserving open and green space. We should take action so that 10 years from now, when we're driving through what is now open space, it is not an unending series of strip malls. And that can be done with tax and grant programs by the federal government to take that open space, which is still green, and preserve it forever. I think this is a critical need for where the Congress should act. And the last reform I'll mention, there are many, we're actually working on about 15 of them, is a growing apprehension by the American people that it may be more difficult for their kids to reach the middle class than it was for them. And so the reform that we're looking at is to build on success, bipartisan success, which is how quickly we shifted the culture of the United States for retirement savings based on the 401k retirement savings account. So that now in suburban America especially, when you get your first real job, you start kicking into your 401k. And one of the things we would like to do is further reform the tax code to create 401 kids tax deferred savings account, so that from the day your child is born, you can begin tax deferred savings for college, for the first time purchase of a home, or to start a business. And I want every spouse on their way home for the delivery room to make it part of their culture that they swing by the bank and establish a 401 kids tax-deferred savings account for their child. By the way, I think it has a secondary educational benefit, that this will be a nest egg for the child, that when the child grows up, they will see this and begin to understand the need for finances, savings, option for them as they become teenagers. This could become a powerful educational tool as well. Anyway, we had about 40 members of Congress meet with the Speaker yesterday on this, planning out this agenda, laying it out in the schedule. And for my hope, I think this is not only the right thing to do, it also reflects the new suburban political reality of the United States. Anyway, thank you for listening. Yeah. How long is that? Good.
Yeah, Congressman Filner.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or as we would say in San Diego, buenas tardes a todos. Thank you, Kid, for being brief and leaving more time.
That's right.
You already Congressman Kirk has already exemplified two oxymorons. It identified him as being naval intelligence, and then a Republican moderate. He put himself squarely in the middle of this whole thing. Jim Hightower said something about those who are in the middle of the road. They get a yellow line down their back and something else. But you might guess I'm way at the other end. I'm usually considered the most liberal, or in my 14 years, I think I'm number 1, 2, or 3 by all the measures. And I come from a military town of San Diego, so that's not easy to be. And I don't pride myself on my bipartisanship, but I pride myself on being a Cornellian. You got to get that right. I showed up at Cornell in 1959 in the engineering school, where they wouldn't let us ever out of that quad. I think I wandered into Ted Lowy's class and saw where the politics are, decided to stay there. Wandered into Sylvie's class, left. But the incredible Cornell experience, which opens you up to so many things. And I'm a child of the 60s. I was there the whole decade. Going through the first, I showed up on campus, and we had a demonstration about compulsory ROTC. And here's a word that you probably haven't heard for a long time: parietal hours. So we were all demonstrating, from the day I arrived, and a whole bunch of us ended up in the civil rights movement. Obviously, I spent a couple months in the state penitentiary in Mississippi during my sophomore summer, and eventually my case went to the Supreme Court. I was on the case with the Supreme Court that abolished, that found unconstitutional segregation of interstate facilities, of public facilities. So, I mean, I was 17 or 18 years old, and I already learned the value of political involvement. I mean, we changed America. We didn't make it perfect, but we actually changed the history of our times by what we were doing. If the Democrat, or when the Democrats get the majority next time, I will be chair of the Veterans Committee, which has my mother turning in her grave, I think, in that I stayed at Cornell after I got a BA in chemistry. There was a war going on, and we still had student deferment, so I decided to try to get a PhD, which I did in the history of science, and left Cornell in 1970, and ended up. I thought Cornell was Ithaca, was just heaven. Then I went to San Diego, where every day it's 70 degrees. And I taught at San Diego State for more than 2 decades, the history of science. So I'll be here for 50 minutes, please. Just settle down. And unlike Kirk again, I mean, I'm sorry, Congressman Kirk. He's still the kid to me, I hated seniority when I got to Congress, but every year it looks better and better, I succeeded the guy who I once worked for. But I didn't wait for his retirement. I beat him in a primary. Thank you. This guy works for me, and he laughs when anything I say. So thank you, Wilmer. Let me tell you what I think is going on for the elections with regard to our two-party system, or supposedly two-party system. Obviously, it's very difficult to beat an incumbent and change the nature of the Congress. I mean, we have fixed this system so well. It's incredible. I think the last decade and a half, 2 decades, maybe Sylvie can give me the exact answer, there's something like a 98.6% reelection rate for U.S. congressmen. That's higher than the Soviet Union ever had at the height of its one-party system. I mean, they allowed 3% deviation. We didn't get that high. And of course, we have a system, some call it financing of campaigns. I call it legalized bribery, where it's very difficult to beat an incumbent. The amount of money has become so enormous. I'm in a primary, in fact, in a couple months in California. I'm going to spend $2 million on just the primary. I mean, that's obscene in terms of the amount of money that's in this system. And yet, that's where we are. And the real reform, I mean, these guys are fooling around on the edges with this stuff. I mean, you got to have public financing of elections. And I mean, I would, my good friend from Texas is back there. He'll probably have me shot when I say this, but I think the redistricting stuff should be taken out of the whole partisan situation and have a truly independent. And I'm not afraid of a competitive race. And I think all good public officials should glory in them. We don't have those today. The parties are most of the districts are fixed in party. Primaries will become the norm, as in California with term limits on virtually every office. Primaries will become the norm in to who is going to be the congressperson. The party that's now the majority, on Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, I think they are just fiendishly brilliant. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think they're dangerously incompetent, if I may coin a phrase. They have been incredibly successful in, I'll say, realizing the dream. No, the dream is for Dr. King. The nightmare that Ronald Reagan had for America. That is, if we put all the money that we can into war and defense, right now the war in Iraq is costing us every 2.5 days $1 billion. If you can imagine the scale of that kind of expense, I mean, it's like, you know, it's so big nobody even sees it. But if you're spending that kind of money, you've made your choices. It just says your home budget or your business budget. You can't do other things. So you put all the money there. Your tax policies, you give everything you can back to the wealthiest amongst us. If you're a millionaire like Lowy or Martin Frost, former congressman over there, you'll get $100,000 back from the government in terms of your tax rebate. The average citizen maybe gets 30, 40, 50 bucks plus increased taxes on a whole variety of things, which I'll mention in a minute. So you decrease your revenue, you give all the money for war, you got no money to do things that in my district, I represent one of the poorest districts in the nation. I have I represent the whole California-Mexico border. Things that my constituents need to be part of the American dream: education, health care, environmental protection, veterans benefits, housing. All these are cut in the Republican budgets in real terms over the years. Veterans, veterans, a sacred cow under normal circumstances, are being cut. They brought in a VA secretary and a chairman of the Veterans Committee to downsize the VA. I mean, it's tragic to see that, but that's the consequence of the choices that they made about war and about taxes. There's nothing left, basically, to do other things. And they would love to privatize the world. I mean, the public sector is going to be starved and made to be looking incompetent. Vouchers for education. We passed, whenever I say we passed, by the way, I voted against whatever it says. We passed vouchers for D.C. schools. The president tried to privatize Social Security. The Medicare Part D plan that is causing so much concern around the country is a privatized system, and that's why it's so bad and it's not working. You have to leave Medicare to get even the few benefits of this prescription drug benefit. You have to join a private HMO. They're trying to privatize air traffic control. I mean, the mad cows themselves would inspect for agriculture if they could get away with it, because that's who they want to be in charge of everything. So they have gutted or attempted to gut the public realm and privatize it wherever you can. That leaves out the people I represent. That leaves out half the people in the nation. Sure, we have suburbs. That's why they got control. By the way, just if you go to the gallery of the House of Representatives, how many have been there recently? Third floor. You look down. There's two sides. Kirk, are you proving everything I'm saying here?
See where you're going.
I'm going to fail you when you get.
That's right.
If you look down, you'd see the two parties, right? They got 232. We got 203. You look over there. They have 0. This is what the suburbanization of America you talked about. 0 African Americans, 1 Mexican American, 1 Jewish American, 0 Asian Americans, 3 Cuban Americans, 25, 30 women. Now, excuse my racism, but they all look alike to me. I mean, they are 99% white. Now, we're not perfect over on the other side, but we got 35, 40 black congresspeople, 25 to 30 Latinos, 80 women. I mean, we look more colorful in so many ways. We represent the urban, the urban multicultural areas. And most of the debates in Congress, by the way, are going like this. They literally live in a different world. They literally live in a different world. And I think it's a short-sighted view, but they don't want their money going to our people. They got college education. They got access to health care. They got a good job. They live in a good house. It's a gated community, no crime. Give me back my taxes, because I don't want those people to have all that. If they haven't made it, it's their inferiority, culturally, morally, spiritually, and any other way. It's the law of the jungle. I mean, they really see the world as God has shined on those who are successful. You haven't, why should we as a government help you out? That's going against natural law or something. Lowy used to teach that, something like that. And we say, we're all in this together. America is stronger when we're all educated, when we're all healthy, when we're all able, to have a decent job. And we've lost that. We've lost that in the ideology that is governing the Congress now. At the same time, they haven't really been competent. They have managed to swerve this whole nation into that way. But when you see the way they run the war, I mean, you can't, this is dangerously incompetent. 25% of the casualties would not have occurred, the study showed, if they had the right armor on. I mean, what do you do this to our kids, sending them war without that, or without the ability to deal with these IEDs? The way we saw Katrina sort of wipes away the veil of competence of this administration. But that's a direct result. It's not just, it's a direct result of their ideology. We don't have to repair levees. We don't have to worry about African Americans. We don't have to worry about urban centers. Let them take care of themselves and see what happens. I think they have dangerously overreached. What I call, not the moderates of Mr. Kirk, but I call them the American Taliban. Sorry, Mark. They want to impose the ideology on us. You saw in the Chavo case what that meant. A terribly personal and difficult decision they want the government to make. They were ready to send troops in Florida to rescue this lady from the personal decision that was made for her. They want us all to believe that. If you read National Journal, there's a poll in there of 50 Congresspeople from the Republicans, 50 Congresspeople of the Democrats. 99% of Democrats in this week's poll believed that global warming is real. Less than 20% of Republicans did. Now, I'm a historian of science. Science I see as an advance of civilization. They don't even want to look at science. They just say it's a liberal plot. It's just, wherever, when it looks to evolution or global warming, a whole bunch of other stuff, you see. So what should the Democrats do? I got 1 minute left. We'll do it in it. I believe it's time, as I said to my colleagues, to neuter the party. And I spell that N-E-W-T. Come on, get that is, by what I described, it would seem to be natural that we have all the issues on our side. Mark talked about all the polls lowering. The only thing lower than the Republicans is the Democrats. That is, they won't look to us as having a reasonable alternative. They believe these guys have overreached. They believe these guys are incompetent. They know how much they're robbing the public sector. But they haven't seen the Democrats, it seems to me, come up with a legitimate alternative. And we got stuff all over the place. There are so many issues for the majority of the people. And we could do a whole lot of different scenarios. Let me just give you one. I'm sort of a populist, I guess. I believe that what we unite the Southern white and the Northern liberal is populism. If you look at gas prices, as a direct result of their of their subsidy of the oil and gas industry. GOP, of course, means gas, oil, and petroleum. We have a situation where 5 multinational companies control the whole price of gasoline. They vertically integrate it, they drill for the oil, they refine it, they sell it to us. They could choose any price they want. It's just what the market will bear. And when we get too much, when we resist too much, they bring it down for a little bit, then they raise it back up. We're like the frogs. Do you know the story about the frog? How do you kill a frog? If you put him in boiling water, he jumps out. Put him in tepid water, nice smile, swimming on his back. You turn up the heat slowly, and he dies with a smile on his face. We're the frogs. That's what the multinationals, oil companies are doing to us. When we're ready to jump out, they lower the gas price. But it's all, it's $1 more than it was 2 years ago. We already got accustomed to the new thing. Then they keep raising it up. Everybody is paying what I call a Bush tax, $50, $60 a week more just to get to work. You can win an election, it seems to me, just on that, because it has ramifications for your a true energy policy that would get us into renewables. It would get us out of the Middle East. We wouldn't have to fight the wars there, and all kinds of ramifications. We should win. We should. All the Democratic congressmen should be at gas stations or pharmacies. As a direct result of their policies, you can't afford prescription drugs if your parents, your grandparents. I mean, it is bankrupting America, the kind of health costs, and people are dying as a result. And and again, it's a basis of what the market will bear. These prices have nothing to do with supply and demand. I mean, it's an economy that's been distorted by all these guys, by their policies. We have the issues to unite the people. It's around the theme, we're all in this together. I believe that if Democrats succinctly and persuasively and emotionally talked about the value that what government is all of us working together and doing what we couldn't do as separately, we would win this election. And we have all these issues to look at, whether it's in health care, whether it's in veterans, whether it's in housing, whether it's in energy policy. I believe that we could, in fact, win the election in 06 and 08 and really restore America to a society when we were all working together. Thank you.
Professor Sobey.
Now you're going to go after me?
No.
I feel more comfortable on the left.
Filner did not walk out of my class. I asked him to leave. Now for Lowy. I'll save that. I must tell you that when I got to Cornell in 1966, one of my colleagues, Don Kagan, came up to me one day and said, would I like to come out and play touch football with them? I said, great, I used to play a lot. And he said, and then I said to him, why are you limping? And he told me, and I never went out. So I never enjoyed the kinds of things that Ted did in the good old days before 1969. It's been pretty clear from what everybody has been saying this afternoon that we are a divided nation, that the election will determine where we are and where we're going, that not only 06 but 08. We are aware of Republican vulnerabilities, and Bob just laid them out, and so on. We're also aware of the strange habits of the American electorate when it comes to casting their ballots, whether or not, for example, it is possible to mobilize a national election against the incumbents is problematic because it has only worked occasionally in our history. More likely, certain congressional seats will be determined by local issues. Certain congressional seats will be determined perhaps by the price of gasoline or a general feeling of malaise or something of that kind. But I think the most important thing I would say is that it's very likely, as has been indicated a number of times today, and really deserves to be underscored, that the elections are going to be close and I don't think decisive. There are Republican vulnerabilities, but there are also Democratic vulnerabilities. As the Cook Report and others have reported, the most useful seats to try to take from one party and the other are those that are vacant, where the incumbent factor is not working. Well, it isn't only that Republicans are leaving Congress, although many are, but just in the last couple of days, a very veteran congressman from Illinois, Lane Evans, who comes from district my wife grew up in, has announced his retirement. That's a very vulnerable district. Sherwin Bollard, a Republican, has just announced his retirement from the district that abuts Ithaca and includes, you forgive the expression, the Ithaca suburbs, and is a very equally vulnerable district. Well, these are scattered all over the country. It's not clear to me that there's going to be a decisive swing. One final point, just to throw some figures in, a number of people keep pointing back both to the 1994 election, which was a big swing, and other big swings that have occurred. But the in the last 5 elections, you know what the average swing in the House of Representatives has been? 3 seats. And in the Senate, 4. So it's not likely that there's going to be a big swing. It's possible the Democrats will win the election. And let us say for the moment that they do, because of the Republican vulnerabilities, that they pick up the necessary 15 or so seats in the House and the 6 seats they would need in the Senate. Then what? Well, we've had lessons over the last few years of how inefficient the government is, not only because of bad people or unprincipled people, but also because we have a constitution against power, as political scientists have told us over and over and over again. We have, as you know, a constitution in which laws of Congress can be vetoed, and then you need a supermajority to override the veto. We have a constitution in which laws passed by the people's representatives can be thrown out by the courts. I'm not saying these are bad things. I understand the reasons for it, but it means that to get anywhere, you have to be aware of the limitations on the power of any part of an institution. And that is particularly true when you have divided government. You will still have a Republican president for at least 3 more years. And you will, if you had a Democratic Congress, then the veto is likely to be used extensively, although President Bush has not done that so far. There's also something else. The congressional rules or customs demand supermajorities. In order to get a bill passed in the Senate, which a controversial bill, you need 60 votes to break a filibuster. Now, the Democrats are not going to come up with 60 votes, nor are the Republicans. They won't have that many. Therefore, the best that, let us say, a Democratic Congress can hope to do would be to be a stop to some of the things that Bob Filner was talking about. They could use that power to prevent things from occurring. But what you're really going to get, it seems to me, is going to be a stalemate for several more years, despite all of the things that are going on. And again, I remind you, we have 7 months to go until the election. And a lot of things can change up to that by then. There's one other point that I'd like to make that has not been talked about much today. And that is the condition within Congress itself in terms of passing laws. I'm a little hesitant to talk about this with two congressmen here, but it strikes me that one of the things that much writing has gone on about is how congressmen are not cooperating with each other much anymore. The cross-sectional, cross-aisle what your personal habits are of no interest to me.
By the way, we have an announcement to make.
But certainly
I've got a deadline to make.
But certainly since the Gingrich Revolution, there has been much less cross-aisle cooperation in the House and in the Senate, and that you get the feeling from that every day as various people come out to report what's going on. The intense polarization of the electorate is also held by the congressmen themselves. I think you can get bipartisan consensus, and I think we were just treated to an example of it. You can talk about things like corruption and reform because those have become cross-aisle issues and are very important. Whether you can do that with tax policy or even the war is another question. So I have a real hesitation about thinking that a great deal will change as a result of the election of 2006. As a historian, one of the first things I tell my students, I have told my students, is that change in America tends to be slow and cumulative over time. When it comes to institutional change like Congress and so on, it takes a very, very long time. The heyday of the Democratic Party, so far as they were concerned, was, of course, from the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 until the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. But even then, Democrats faced with a national crisis, moved to try to combat it, had clearly a mandate to do so. Supreme Court booted everything out for a while until that could be overcome. And so on, and so on, and so on. So I think that one has to take the long view here and say, well, look, whatever happens, it's going to happen over a period of time. And my hunch is, given some of the volatility that has crept in here, that it's going to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Without 2001, without 9/11, there wouldn't have been a war in Iraq because I think the Democrats would have been much more forceful in resisting it at that time. But we had that now, so you can't count on, you don't know what might come up. There's one final point about looking into the future, and that has been referred to several times today as well, and that is the nature of Congress. As a representative institution. When I first voted in New York State had 43 congressmen. At the last election, it had 29. And after the 2010 election, I suspect it will lose one or two more. And that, of course, is happening in the old Northeast and the Rust Belt generally. The places that are growing in terms of population and will get more congressmen are the red states. And I don't mean by that only Florida and Arizona, but other places. The fastest growing states since the last census are places like Wyoming, Colorado, and so on. And who knows what will happen as this grows on. All I know is that the clout that the blue states have, if that still remains a viable way of thinking about these things, will be diminished as with each census as these patterns go on. Again, these are realities that have to be taken into account when you think about what bodes for the future. I am by nature an extremely optimistic person. How else could I have lived in Ithaca for 40 years? I know that global warming someday will affect Ithaca. It hasn't as yet. But there is also my historian sense that one has to think through what has happened in the past and what is likely to happen in the future, and be aware that the rosy scenarios and rosy hopes have to be often tempered. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turn things over to Gene Cummings.
So, two things. I'm suffering from a terrible cold, so if you don't understand me, that's good. And secondly, I know my University of Maryland degree doesn't quite fit in here, so I'll use a better one. I live 10 minutes from George Mason University. I'll be real quick, and I'll talk probably more nuts and bolts. In a midterm election, turnout is what drives everything. And so one way to go and analyze, if it's hanging in the balance, then you look kind of dryly at what are the strengths and weaknesses of the machines on either side when it comes to turning out the vote, because they're notoriously low turnout elections. And, bases can have, and other population groups can have a disproportionate effect. Secondly, I think issues are going to be important this year. That's not always the case, but I do think that this year our climate is so intense that issues are going to be important, both as motivators and as deflators of voters. So when you look at the Republicans' turnout machine, what you see is that Ken Mehlman over at the RNC is extraordinarily disciplined. And he's what was started in 2000, really in 2001 and 2002 by the Bush team, has never stopped. He's very robotic kind of worker, and he just keeps at it. And so they've been registering voters. They've been keeping in contact with their team leaders. They know how to develop a statewide, down to the precinct organization. They should have plenty of money to do that if they want. Now, it's in a midterm election, it depends a lot on the senators and the House members, how well they conduct themselves. And that applies to state level, too. I'm going to go down in a couple of weeks to take a look at what's going on with Ralph Reed's race in Georgia. And obviously, there's a whole lot of talk about Abramoff and Ralph's connections with that, and it's become a drag on his campaign. But when I talked to him, the first thing he told me about was how many precinct captains he's got, because Ralph Reed comes from the grassroots ring of the Republican Party, and all the messages in the world can't beat foot traffic to the polls. So you have basically a very good, probably well-oiled machine on the Republican side. What you have, though, is a great fracture among their base. So while you may have the machine there, it may not be as easy to turn out the bodies. Also, President Bush was a very compelling figure, or vice versa, Kerry was not a compelling figure. But at any rate, you had the evangelical wave of sorts that went on in 2004 with the Supreme Court in place and not an obvious issue to drive them out, and yet some issues to conflict them. We don't know if we're going to see that kind of turnout. So you have two things going on. You have the intensity and the machine. And the Republicans will have probably the machines in place. We don't know about the intensity, and we know that they're fractured. The fiscal conservatives are very depressed about what's happening with the budget. You see quotes from them all the time in the media saying, we deserve to be thrown out. Well, these are people who are not going to go vote, and that's a really bad thing for the Republicans in a midterm election. Now let's look at the Democratic side. The Democratic side, by all polls, has high intensity. Democratic voters are very energized. They want to vote. They want to beat the Republicans. So you will have probably a high turnout amongst the energized base. Will they have any kind of machine to drive broader turnout? That really is unclear right now for a couple of reasons. First of all, Kerry ended up relying on a ad hoc group of 527s to do a lot of his turnout. Those groups don't exist right now and are unlikely to be recreated. The DNC, meanwhile, has conducted a few experiments. The Chairman Dean, and rather than building from a centralized headquarters, heard a lot from the party chairmen who were very frustrated in 2004 because they wanted resources given to them so that they could conduct their turnouts. So Dean has gambled on them this year. So nobody knows if they're going to work or not. The state party chairman, in their defense, had good arguments. If you look at the end of the 2004 race and you look at what happened in the Senate, the Democrats did not have to take that big a hit. But the Kerry campaign pulled out of Missouri in the last 10 days, where a candidate was doing quite well there. They never went into North Carolina. Possibility they could have pulled it out. There would have been tough. Alaska was probably within reach. So, you know, there were several races where if the National Party had been playing at a national level, then the Senate might not have gone so far Republican. So these are their arguments. Dean is experimenting this year, and we will see if that process works. But again, can the intensity be strong enough to outweigh the weaknesses in the machine? We'll see on that. Then you go below that into the subsectors, specific populations. Seniors are always disproportionately represented in a midterm election. So what kind of issues do we have motivating them this season? They're mixed. The Republicans did not make the seniors happy with the drug plan. We all know that. They can't figure it out. They're unhappy. This is not a winner. On the other hand, if you look at a poll done by the Wall Street Journal recently, seniors are very concerned about immigration. Now, I'm not suggesting that seniors would embrace the harshness of the House bill, but our poll suggests that they lean closer to the House bill than they do necessarily to the Senate bill. So this debate that's just beginning is going to be a critical debate as we move forward in terms of how it might motivate that important block of voters, and then flip the coin to the Hispanics. You know, when you talk about red states and blue states and where is the population growing, it isn't growing in the blue states, true. It's growing in the red states. In a way, they could turn them into blue states because the growth is in the Hispanic people and moving into those states. If the Democrats can ever harness that vote in any consistent fashion, it could completely realign, which is one of the reasons that Karl Rove has made that a very top priority for the Bush administration. That's why Bush supports the Senate bill. But these demonstrations that have taken place in the streets out there cannot be overlooked for how important they are. This was basically a silent block of voters. Everybody wanted them, but many of them were too afraid to come forward. Now their legal children are taking the streets on their behalf, on the behalf of their parents, and these kids can vote. They're starting to really join in and take a stake in the process, which we haven't seen a whole lot of in the Hispanic community. This is going to be a really unusual dynamic and one we've not seen before that could play an important role come November, particularly if immigration is still hanging out there as the divisive issue that it is. On issues, immigration clearly is the biggest thing out there right now. The Republicans hope to raise it to energize their base. It may be in the process of backfiring against them. We don't know that yet. They had hoped to use security. There again, Dubai ports may make that backfire on them, but the Democrats have yet to demonstrate any ability to take the security issue, even when they're given an opening, and turn it to their advantage. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. Right now, they have a small window of opportunity. If they fail to move the security issue, to keep it in single digits, which is where they are right now, there used to be a double-digit advantage to Republicans. If the Democrats can squeeze it down into single digits, then it may be okay to start talking about domestic issues with voters having some level of comfort with the Democrats and the war on terrorism. If they lack any comfort with the Democrats and it's a toss-up, they'll probably go Republican, because still that sense of security is an important issue in voters' minds. Last thing is corruption. I know there are a lot who say that that just runs both ways. To some degree, it does. But broadly, this is a Republican problem. There was a new indictment today. There will be other indictments. I don't think there's going to be a Democrat indicted. Today, Tony Rudy, who worked for Tom DeLay, pled guilty. And so that puts it into DeLay's office. There's no indication yet that the former majority leader is going to be indicted, but what's in this indictment does seem to tighten the noose around Bob Ney. So we shall see where this goes. But I think that Republicans who think that they can sort of blend this out and say, well, you know, it's everybody's bad because a couple of Democrats' names get thrown into newspaper stories are kidding themselves. because the only people who are going to be walking into court are probably going to be Republicans. So I'll say one last thing and then I'll sit down. There's been a lot of talk about 1994, and is that a model for the Democrats to try to take over the House? In 1994, I happened to be working for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, spending every waking moment of my life with Newt Gingrich. This was an exciting time in my life. I started traveling with him in like 1992 and through the 1993 and 94 and lead up to the elections. So here's what he did, and I don't know if it'll work for the Democrats or not, but he recruited somebody to run against everybody everywhere. So if there was a wave, voters had somebody to vote. They had an alternative. And, you know, that we in Washington tend to look at these House seats, you know, really precisely about, you know, how, you know, this is 65% this, and so it's going to stay that way forever. Well, in 1994, there were a lot of 65% Democratic seats, not a lot of them, but a good handful, that went Republican because of the wave. Now, they shook out. Over the course of time, a lot of those people ended up losing their seats. But it created the wave. It gave them the majority. It gave them incumbency, and it gave them a great big advantage to try to cling to those seats in those future elections. So have the Democrats recruited in a way that prepares them for a big wave? I don't think so, but they're still recruiting. Again, the energy intensity level. Gingrich was out constantly. He was a great surrogate for the party. The best surrogate for the Democratic Party these days is probably Hillary Clinton, who does not want to get involved in the midterm election. She's got to win her own. So where's the alternative? Where's the person who can go out there? I went to 1 million breakfasts. They only cost $5, but for the little guy running in Indiana, getting $150 on that morning and seeing, you know, 100 of his friends, that was an important event. And bringing in Newt Gingrich gave him big free media and the local media. Where's that alternative character? I don't know that we see that person. I'm not sure that we need it, but it's something to consider when you weigh what might happen. Finally, the Contract for America served two purposes. First of all, it gave the Republicans, yes, a positive alternative vision. Bear in mind, they never said they were going to pass them all. They were very careful. They said we're going to vote on them all. They defeated 3 of them, but they just said they'd vote on them. So that gives the Democrats some wiggle room. I don't know if the Democrats could ever surround themselves, because they are like herding cats, any long list. But, 3, 4 major principles might work. But this is the other practical thing that it did that I thought in 1993 and 94 was really important. It gave those candidates who were freshly recruited, businessmen, Rotary Club members, PTA mothers, whatever, who had not run for office before, it gave them something to say. And it made them sound like they weren't just talking about saving, the local historic site, or, saving money for, the local corn crop, where they just sounded like they ought to be running for a city council or a state legislative seat. All of a sudden, they could stand there with a contract with America and start talking about global things, national issues, and they had the language right in front of them. Now, some of them try to do Newt was really entertaining. But at any rate, they sounded like, they kind of got it, and that they could be in Congress and not just in the state legislature. And so that's kind of ran under the radar screen at the time, but it was a really practical advantage that they had. So those are just some things, food for thought as we move into the campaign.
Let's allow our other panelists to follow up with any comments that they might have on what has gone after them. Congressman Kirk, do you have anything to say? Or?
I would like to hear questions.
All right. Congressman Filner? No. All right. Well, let me toss out the first one, then we'll open it up to the audience. But one of the things I think that has been mentioned in passing today by a couple of people is the fact that because there seems to be so much polarization in Congress now between the parties, it's difficult to come together and get some of the important things done that need to be done for the country, whether it's addressing Social Security, which President Bush was not able to get off the launch pad, or whether it's looking at the uninsured and health care, or the problem.
When you're in the center looking out on both ends of the aisle, you see that the American people are under a government the Founding Fathers designed to be slow and deliberative, and in general, one in which the Founding Fathers were very afraid of a very active government that could move quickly. And so there is a time for a consensus on an issue and a time when there is no consensus on an issue. Probably the classic example of that was welfare reform, in which when it was first proposed, it was very controversial and very strongly opposed, and by the end it was President Clinton enacting it. Obviously, airport security, another one, where a bill just before September 11th would have never happened, and then we created the second largest federal agency in history afterwards. Or regardless of where you are on Medicare reforms for prescription drug, there was not a consensus, and then by the end we enacted legislation, which the Founding Fathers dedicated was a very hard thing to do. We are moving towards a consensus on immigration. It isn't there yet, but I can clearly feel it is front and center, and somewhere between where Senator Frist is and where Senator McCain is I think where the center is, and we are headed towards that issue. There are other things that have changed, though, in the Congress, and I'll just say socially the Congress is very different. And one of the reasons why, I think, is because of how cheap airline tickets are. When I talk to my predecessors from the 60s, they talk about how they loaded up the U-Haul and came out to Washington for 6 months. And so there was a social life and a social context on Saturday, the weekend, Sunday, Monday, in which members of Congress, especially if they were on the same state delegation or committee, hung out. Because it only cost $200 to fly to O'Hare, the corporate culture of the Congress has changed, and whether you are a freshman or a senior member of Congress, you are expected immediately, within 10 minutes of the last vote, to get on a plane and be with your constituents. And so there are only 2 nights a week now in which members of Congress are in Washington, and therefore they stack their events very heavily, and there is little to no hanging out together. But that is entirely because you are expected to be in your district, and about 85% of them are. Last thing I'll say is I do feel a polarization of the electorate, and you can call for many reasons why, but I think part of the reason why is because, and I'll just speak from Chicagoland's perspective, 30 years ago, most everyone read the Chicago Tribune, and most everyone watched Huntley, Brinkley, or Cronkite. And so their view of the world came almost entirely from 2 sources of news. And if everyone is reading or seeing the same television news, in general, there's a broad consensus. What I see from the railroad station of Wilmette now is all the Democrats are watching CNN, and all the Republicans are watching Fox, which, use entirely different words. On CNN, it's undocumented worker. On Fox, it's illegal alien. And through, on CNN, it's suicide bomber. On Fox, it's homicide bomber. And especially on websites now, people really want to read news that they already agree with. And I have seen as a centrist, I've seen a great drop in the center. Anybody kind of Tribunist, Cronkite people left here? Because there was a great center, and it was fueled by everybody consuming the same media. And now I run into people all day long that, haven't seen CNN in years or haven't seen Fox in years. And especially now they're consuming news via the websites, especially blogs. And those blogs are really fragmented, and people really prefer the blog that fits their own prejudices. And so their attitudes and their views are becoming pretty hard line on one side or the other.
Congressman Filner?
I agree with everything Mark said except about the cost of airline tickets.
Yeah, right. California.
I mean, I got to go to San Diego, and it costs, $1,200 round trip or something to go on a nonstop. But they still expect me to be there. There are a couple things that I would leave to the academics maybe to explain to me as I look at Congress and try to deal with your question. Number one, if you look at the 435 members of our House, there are some incredible people there. I mean, some really smart people, people who have had all kinds of different accomplishments in their lives, and academically or business or whatever. But we are not the sum of our parts. I mean, we just all go our 435 ways on Thursday night, and while we're there, this polarization is there, and it's very difficult to break it. Any two of us, or three, or five, or eight, could probably sit down and solve every issue that we have. I don't care where they are in the spectrum, because people can talk and deal with things. When you get into the party, the polarization, or the parties take over, then you can't do anything. And it's counterintuitive. I remember when we had these real close Senate and House differences. Everybody said, well, they're all going to work together now because they're so, there's even numbers. But it's the exact opposite, because every little thing that takes place can affect who has the power. So you got to fight over every little thing, because that means if you lose on that, you may lose, your 6 seats or your 9 seats or your 3 seats, whatever. It's so close that we fight over every little thing, and it's all power as opposed to rational discussion of the issues. I mean, I don't pride myself on my centrism, but I pride myself on common sense. And there are lots of things that we can deal with. I mean, I got small business people in my district who have, let's say, a dentist who has this much of a chemical that he uses in one operation. But the OSHA law says you got to have a shower because it was based on having a barrel of that in some factory. So I put a bill in to say if you're a small business with that thing, you shouldn't have to put a shower if you have that chemical. Well, the Democrats look at me and say, you can't do that. That's the beginning of the end of OSHA. I mean, that's the nose under the camel's tent. It'll all fall down. Then the Republicans look at it and say, hey, that's the nose under the camel's tent. Let's just bring it all down. And so I can't even pass a little bill that says, if you got this much of whatever the chemical the dentist was using, you don't need a shower. And the same is endangered species. And I mean, you go through everything. There are a lot of common sense that every one of us could solve, in a few minutes. For the party structures prevent us from doing that, and all of the goodies come from the party. That is, Mark talks, that he's at the center there, but on every procedural vote that really determines the outcome, on every vote for a leadership, he's got to go with his party. I don't care where you are in the party spectrum, you're going to be there, or they're going to deny you all the goodies that the party can bring, a chairmanship of a committee, the earmarks that we're supposed to get, on and on and on. So the party has enormous power over people and takes away our ability to do with these common sense. And maybe Silby can give us a historical reason why that's so.
I could, but I'll do what Loie does and say, come up to Ithaca, where we can spend some time on this. I just want to say one thing about what you just said. It isn't simply that the parties insist on this. There are these differences. It is a nose under the tent. It is. And both sides realize it. And I'm very much sympathetic with what you said, that every little thing becomes a major thing because the differences are there. They really are different. If you get an exception on this OSHA thing for this, which makes a heck of a lot of sense to this guy, but not if somebody then picks it up and runs with it to use it as the beginning of a wedge to do something else. It sounds far-fetched, but it's happened before. I mean, I think that some of the situations we are in now is when Richard Nixon, almost 40 years ago, began to talk about lowering taxes. Sure, you want to get rid of social welfare, lower taxes, because you're not going to have anything. You could also, somebody out there's also going to say, and start wars. But these are real issues, and people have to take the long view on these. I don't think it's necessarily healthy for the country. I doubt that at all. But nevertheless, that's where we are. We have to live with that. It's not likely to change. And the real question is, how do you get those 3 to 5 people together to work on these things? If I may, just to follow this up, I'd be very curious to hear Mark Kirk. How is he treated within the Republican caucus?
sometimes I'm radioactive. One of the things that you do when you're independent, when you're really independent, is you strip the Speaker of power to stop a bill, which is called signing a discharge petition. And so I remember I was wrestling because I'm a very strong supporter of John McCain and campaign finance reform. And there came a time when the leadership would not bring campaign finance reform to the floor. And I was wrestling with this because I knew that I would pay the ultimate price with my party if I honored this commitment that I made during my first campaign. And I talked to my predecessor, John Porter, and said, I'm wrestling with this vote because I think I'm going to end my career in its first 6 months. And John said, Mark, in your first year in office is no time to lose your soul. You know, the only constituent that matters is this one right here. So I walked to the well and I signed the discharge petition, which was the act of ultimate treachery, stripping the Speaker of his authority to hold that bill. And lo and behold, 21 of us signed that, and campaign finance reform came to the floor. Not only came to the floor, we enacted it into law. And I must admit, I planned for the rest of my time in Congress to be on the Merchant Marines and Fisheries Committee as a Midwestern congressman.
But they abolished that.
They abolished it,
Yeah, but
fortunately.
they abolished that committee. I would say, though, that the place is all about relationships, and I managed to get an appointment as a pro-choice Republican on the Appropriations Committee. So I came back from the dead, and it was all about relationships. And I will say this. The system looks worse than it is for one key thing. You have to also realize that if it's not on Fox and it's not on CNN, it still may have happened. In this way, when you look at the work of the Congress, in the end, by the time we get to Christmas, all of the appropriations bills, with issues from abortion to zebras, have all been enacted into law and through the Senate, where a filibuster was pending. Other major pieces of legislation have also gone through and been enacted, as well as several hundred relatively non-controversial pieces of legislation, all enacted into law. How did that happen? And the answer is, for the most controversial pieces of legislation, they were all worked out during what I would call the magic time. And the magic time this year will be around October 10th. It will be in a room run by the Appropriations Committee, Democrats and Republicans from the Senate, Democrats and Republicans from the House, and White House people, all in the same room, about 60 to 70 critical issues, all attached to the final end-of-year appropriations bill. And they will be all worked out in one night. And it is impossible for the electronic media in the news cycle to cover that story. They miss all of the stories because all of the compromises, about 70 of them, hit around 6, 7 a.m. the next morning. And the media collapses and doesn't cover the story. And therefore, according to you, it didn't happen. But it did happen. It gets enacted into law and everything is worked out. You just... because of the way we cover news, you didn't see it.
For the record, the Wall Street Journal does cover
Right,
it.
that's right. That's right.
I just had one thought, and that I think that you don't necessarily need a wave to change the way that Washington works. It seems to me if you have some symbolic victories, they could have as much impact. Perhaps not as much, but they could come close. So it may depend on who loses as much as how many lose.
I would just add one comment to Mark. I predict the magic date will not be October 10th, but December 10th.
Maybe December 10th.
After the election.
Sleigh bells always help work things out. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the audience. We have two questions here. Susan, if you could pass the microphone.
That's right. Oh, yeah, definitely.
They're talking about immigration. Lame duck.
Oh, yeah.
Question is for both congressmen. I've been dying to ask this to congressmen for probably years. So it takes you millions of dollars to get to your position, only to have to do it again in 2 years. So essentially, you sit down at your new desk and you've got to start raising money again for your next election. Do you think you could be elected if you weren't spending millions of dollars on your campaign?
No.
I
Well, go ahead.
I mean, no, but again, I think we could have public financing, free television, and debates that would make that election process truly a democratic exercise, as opposed to what it is now, entertainment and who can sound best in 30 seconds. So it's unfortunate. I mean, I would like to play by a different set of rules, and I'm trying to change them, but I got a set of rules I got to play by.
But you also see that the person with the biggest pot wins too.
95% of the time, it's the size that counts.
I would totally disagree, because I'm a monument to that. When my predecessor announced by surprise he was retiring, 11 people jumped in the primary. Of the 11 candidates in the primary, 8 were multimillionaires, and 1 was a billionaire, the heir to the Yellow Pages fortune. So in the primary, the billionaire, she spent about $5.5 million. And the millionaires all were plus 2 or 3 million. In Chicagoland, we did not sell any toothpaste or cars in the month of March, because it was wall-to-wall TV ads. I had none. By the time we came to the election day, I had been outspent 15-1. And I won. And it was proof that you can be too cynical here in Washington, and that I regularly see candidates who are outspent winning, because quality and hard work and fire in the belly really do make a difference. And while you see a lot of incumbents raising money, in the end, most incumbents, like Joel says, are pretty safe. And if they didn't raise that money, they'd still win. And I think one of the realities of the modern Congress is, if you're doing a hard-working job, and if your staff is hard at it, helping people out with immigration problems, finding Social Security checks, etc., there is a natural base of several hundred people that you should have helped, you did help, and they like you, and it builds up a natural base of support. And in general, the American people, once they vote for you, it's a statement that they like you, and it's hard to change their mind. Because once they put you in office, it's a statement that I voted for this person. And so the big money chase, I think, is overstated. Is it important for the control of Congress? You bet, because the control of Congress is largely dependent on open seats, where lots of money is spent. But for a lot of members, they have sleepy races, they're not raising much money, and the people in their district generally think they're doing a pretty good job.
Let's go to Carl Lubsdorf with the Dallas Morning News.
Question for Congressman Kirk. We keep hearing in regard to the election that there is a lot of concern, even panic, in some Republican ranks over Iraq, and that Iraq may so depress turnout that, which Gene correctly said is a big factor, that alone could drive enough voters away from the polls and cost the Republicans the election. How concerned are the members of your party about that?
I think they should be concerned. For Republicans in the Congress, and I used to work as a staffer in the Congress when the Democrats had these incredible majorities. And I remember on Election Day in 1994 that hardly any of them thought that they would lose. And there were these long, well, Don remembers, there was these long, retirement plans and succession plans, et cetera, because, of course, we all know the Democrats are going to run the House forever. Just stunning arrogance. And for the party that defeated that arrogance, you can't be arrogant in reverse. That's the whole reason why we came. We overcame that with a big election victory, and so you can't possibly stand in front of a group of political analysts and say that the reversal could never happen. It absolutely could happen, and you should be aware of it. And the American people could easily change parties. And when we look through our history, Americans tend to like divided government. It forces everybody to talk to each other when there's a divided government. And so I think it clearly could be a possibility.
Okay, let's go over here to Stephen Shore.
One possible sleeper issue, we have two new Supreme Court justices who allegedly will interpret but never even think of making law. Is there a possibility of a Supreme Court decision between now and Election Day which could really stir the pot?
Most likely there will be. We're going to have at least one on the war, which was argued yesterday, on military tribunals. That one may not have a big impact because it's about executive power, and the power between Congress and the White House may not be the biggest turnout argument, but there's an abortion case, and so the partial birth abortion is up, and that could be a terrific motivator for the Democrats if they lose it, and the Republicans, I think, if they lose it, it could be devastating. Completely demoralize the base after they've taken, captured both those seats. So I think it could run neutral. The Republicans expect to win that case. And if they lose it, I think it would demoralize the base. So I think in the grand scheme of things, the upside is that it could motivate the Democrats if they lose.
Anybody else have any speculation on cases pending that could be...
They probably will delay that decision.
I don't think they can.
I don't think Supreme Court has lame duck sessions, but...
Oh, we have the Tom DeLay case, too.
The Tom DeLay case also, yes. This gentleman in the front row?
Obviously, my major issue right now is the energy dependency, decreasing the fuel prices. And I guess my question is, it's sort of frustrating. We continue to be dependent on foreign oil for our energy supply, and the supplies are reducing in competition. I guess the question I have, I'm a supporter of drilling into Anwar and off the coast, and I'm trying to think whether there's a way that we can profit from our own energy resources and drill in these areas, and also at the same time use some of the profits maybe for the environmental protection or something like that, or to set aside and use it to reduce the budget deficit, and so we don't have so much more of our money going into the foreign suppliers of energy, because while we have potential alternative fuels and all that stuff, they're not ready for prime time right now. So I'm concerned that our increasing dependency on foreign oil and not being prohibited from developing our own resources at home is going to hurt our economy and and make us more beholden to foreign suppliers.
I think this is where we might surprise you. I think Bob and I both agree that we should protect the wildlife refuge, and we should lift the fuel economy standards of cars and trucks sold in America. And I think the one other thing I think we probably agree is that we should someday build the Taconic Falls Cold Fusion Center in Cornell.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's right.
Are you? Should we have earmarks?
That's right.
Oh, okay. I don't think this is a no-brainer in that. I mean, we have the capacity now to run this country off alternative fuels, whether it's solar or wind. I got the biggest geothermal works in my district. These are not brand new. These are decades-old technologies. We don't need to drill for more oil, especially the low amounts that will come from the ones you mentioned. We have the ability to get off our oil dependence now, and we ought to do it. It would be healthy in foreign affairs. It would create jobs. Most of these, although the oil companies are trying to control hydrogen now, it's difficult to control the sun. They'll try it, but it's a decentralized kind of energy provisions, and so more people can be involved in the economy, and I think it's healthy all the way around. Save our planet, save our economy, and I tell you, I just don't understand a raise of 5 miles a gallon on these fuel standards saves, I don't know, something like 20% or something of the foreign oil that we import, and yet, because of the domination of the Congress by special interests, I mean, you can't get it through. I'm not just talking one party here. You can't get anything through that the car guys don't like or the oil guys don't like. I mean, it's just disgraceful that we are supposed to be representing the American people, and we can't even get, the easiest kind of approach toward renewable energy. It's mind-boggling if you actually look at what is intelligent and what the representatives of the people end up voting for.
President Bush is placing more emphasis on alternative fuels. Is there going to be another energy bill in this Congress prior to the election? Or?
That's a weapon of mass distraction. Look, we passed an energy bill. I told you, when I say we, I don't mean me. And we passed an energy bill that the administration put forward. It's something like $16 billion for oil and coal and gas and $1 billion for renewable energy. They're talking a good game, but they don't put any money into it. They don't put any lobbying into it. They don't put any. They don't take their their lobbyists and harness them at all. So, yeah, I mean, they're talking now, but they don't do one thing that really pushes it forward.
Okay. Other questions? Here, second row.
Just wonder if I could link this panel to the first one a little bit and bring the presidential leadership into the fate of the Congress and the parties. I might not get this all straight, but I'm not clear whether we've decided that culture has divided our country into polarization, or maybe the elites and the parties have contributed to the polarization of the country. And I'm thinking that when President Bush was first elected, that he was a compassionate conservative, and he worked on No Child Left Behind, and he reached across the aisle, and I thought that might be a good way to get things done and go down the middle. And then either they decided it's better for the party throughout the country to build the party on a polarized mode, or that's how was that the decision made, and is that, or are we so polarized that that's the only way for either party to maintain any chance at control, which is to be totally polarized and lead as a polarized party?
Well, look, from my perspective, how are you going to win? By making nice to the other side? You say they're really a bunch of nice guys, and I'd really like to have them with us on this. You don't. I mean, politics by its very nature is confrontational. It's not consensual. There are consensual elements in politics. And when they occur, certain things get done. But politics, particularly the politics of elections, are and have to be confrontational. You have to do in the other side. Whether you do it nicely or not is another question. So I don't see any problem there, except the fact that we don't like that. But what would you substitute for it? Lowy has left the room, so I can't ask him if... oh, he's here.
He shifted to the left.
Then I won't embarrass him by asking about the John Anderson solution. But I don't see what else you can do.
I actually think there is a different way. I think that one of the ways that you win is, in fact, by being nice to the other side, not necessarily the other opponent.
Oh.
There's a difference. And Clinton walked that line. And Bush tried to walk that line. And I think there is a way, and it's probably necessary in the next election, if we see a candidate try to do it, that's what they're trying to do, and that's to take moderates and make them more moderate Republicans, make them more comfortable with the Democratic side, or vice versa. I think a couple of things contributed to the polarized environment we're in right now. It was the nature of the 2000 victory, a 5-4 ruling by the Supreme Court. So nobody conceded, and nobody really won. And nobody went home after the war. Everybody just hung around on the battlefield. So that, so that gives you 4 years of when, and then we have September 11th in the middle, and so, all right, everybody gets real patriotic. And then I think that the Democrats felt like the Bush White House betrayed that moment. And they took advantage of that moment. And so then, when it became acceptable to challenge the opposition, they did so with a vigor that perhaps the White House never saw coming. And that was because of Max Cleland, and the things that went on in the 2002 election were anything but, maintaining that sort of we're all Americans, You know, it was really it was harder ball politics than it needed to be. So I think we have a lot of special dynamics that are happening right now. I don't think it's an easy fix, but I do think there's a place in between and room for a candidate to go there.
My point would be, in response to that, that yes, there are times when people are compassionate and caring and so on, but that all I'm trying to say is the very nature of politics moves you into confrontation. Again, particularly in elections, and you may have diversions from that, but I'm not sure that they last for very long, and I'm not sure which is the special circumstance and which is the ordinary circumstance.
But the one caveat, Joel, is that the gerrymandering creates that in far more toxic form than you would have. I mean, I could create different districts where a moderate would win. We have created districts in every state except Iowa or something that the extreme is the winner. I mean, we've picked our own voters as opposed to voters picking us. And I mean, if you look at California, it's 53 of us, the most diverse state in the union. Every Californian Republican has a 0 or 100 score with all the scorecards, you know, the lobbying groups and the ideological groups. You're either 100 or 0. Same with Democrats. In Texas, as Martin, everybody in Texas is 40, 50, or 60. I mean, they just have a whole different culture there. We're all 0 or 100. And I live right there. I mean, I live a mile away from Duncan Hunter and Duke Cunningham. You would think we live right next to each other. We'd have someone is wrong, and yet each of us gets elected with 2/3 of the vote, and we're as far apart as you can get. That's because the districts have been selected in that way, and you get the kind of people that district is made for. I mean, it's no accident that it happens. Incumbents have protected themselves in every state.
And I guess I represent
so cynical.
I represent a totally different politics. You know, and I've had a long talk with the president about this, and we don't have a joint political strategy because for me, it's to look at a very broad center and build from the center out, not from the right. For me, I don't start with the premise of I dislike Democrats because then I would have to dislike my own mother, you know, and I want I want her vote, and I earn it. I think you know, like what I talked about on building a 401 kids plan or making sure that we have tort reform to accelerate environmental cleanup, et cetera. Broad-based, good, new ideas from the center, command victories. And in my area, particularly, everybody thinks of the old Tom DeLay strategy as raise money and go negative. Well, at least in my part of the country, the first candidate to be seen as mean loses. I had probably, I think I had the second most tight race in the country in the 2000 election, in a district that voted 10 percentage points for Vice President Gore. And I won because I held my fire, I never went negative, always stayed on the big concerns of my district, and my opponent went negative, and she was just seen as mean. And in the next election, you come back with a huge victory, and now I represent a district that voted heavily for Kerry, heavily for Barack Obama, and heavily for me. But that is because you're commanding from the center, and you're never looking at the other party as the enemy. It's just a place actually to build common ground. And would it be better for me to just hang out with a bunch of Republicans and all agree and say, ain't it awful? Intellectually, and maybe as far as the time of my day concerned, that would be easier. But I see the whole vision of the Founding Fathers, especially in the structure of the Senate, as forcing you to go to the other side and work with other people. And I generally see, like when you look at the emerging McCain candidacy, that's clearly where he's at, and building from the center out.
Front row here.
Mark, perhaps you should lead our own Kadima party if we had our own parliamentary structure.
Who just won as well. Probably the worst environment in the world.
But my question actually goes to both of you and everybody on the panel. Professor Lowy in Intro Government, yes, if Professor Lowy's still here, talks about legicide and Congress abdicating its power and no longer viewing itself as a co-equal branch of government. We recently saw with the Dubay port deal, Congress finally found its some gut. Do you see this moving forward?
What was the last? I didn't hear the last thing.
Do you see Congress being a co-equal branch of government?
Do I? No. By the way, when you have all the branches of government in one party, as we do now, it's very difficult to have. I mean, there's no oversight right now. I mean, talk about. I mean, Clinton was impeached. Bush should be impeached, but he won't be. I mean, it's just the nature of the majority in the Congress. So Congress has lost over a historical period. I mean, since World War II, certainly. I mean, it's all been more and more dominant by the executive branch, and we do not fight back when our own party is in charge. And all these inroads are made. I mean, what the president is doing now with this surveillance, for example, or the war itself, or I mean, there are so many things that he's concentrating power for that if it was Clinton, I mean, they would be on him every single day. So the lack of divided government or so-called unified government, I don't know what you call it, well, the reverse, but has this impact, and it just keeps more and more power. I mean, these guys, when the president says reform is take away earmarks. That means the executive decides everything, right? And we haven't figured out a language to argue that those are, appropriate as long as we're not bribed to do it, So I am very pessimistic as I see the more and more authority leaving the legislative branch myself. Historian?
I'd just say that there are various basic blocks of philosophy in the Congress. Some people might be the entrepreneurial types. Other people might be the I want safety types, and they're very extreme. I'm part of the solutionist camp. Let's build bipartisan majorities on both sides and get something to the president, whether it's President Clinton or President Bush, that moves the issue forward. And for me, I think if you look at the broad scope of American history, you would see that in time of international shock and war, vast authority is given to the executive branch, whether it be Franklin Roosevelt or George W. Bush. That is a natural result of September 11th. And regardless of how this election turns out, I think you'll see a far more active legislature, because when we're not scared and when we're not responding to the immediate murder of 3,000 Americans, we generally do not rally behind the commander-in-chief, and we question him very strongly. And I think we are just getting over the September 11th shock and recovering our voice. And I would
that's
say
when he'll lead Iran, right?
Well, no, I think it's very, very natural for everyone to rally to whomever the commander-in-chief is when Pearl Harbor is attacked or when the towers come down.
The trouble with that is that it may be too late on a lot of fronts. The Congress conceded a terrific amount of ground, and not saying that they ultimately might have come to the same place, but they largely did it without debate and without any real thought. And as a consequence, these cases are moving through the courts already. Now, the White House did give a lot of thought to what they did, and they pushed the line as far as they possibly could go, and in some cases knowing they might be over it. When I interviewed Attorney General Gonzalez when he was still at the White House, and he said, maybe I got the line wrong, but that's up to the courts to decide. He knew he'd pushed to wherever they wanted to be, and if they have to if they're going to be reined in, so be it. But until then, they're running the show, and they will get the maximum out of the courts that they could possibly get, and that's what the Congress sacrificed. Granted, everyone rallied around the flag, but there were a lot of legislation that didn't necessarily come within those first 4 or 5 days, and certainly in this time that's come later, there has not been any scrutiny, whereas if there had been, well, there's been limited scrutiny, and if there had been an adversarial relationship between either a Democratic White House or Republican Congress or the reverse, we would not have the situation. Now, there would have been much more aggressive push probably on the side of Congress, but it may be too late because the courts will rule and that will become the law of the land.
Okay, let's go to the young lady in the second row from the back.
I campaigned on the ground.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, I campaigned on the ground for John Kerry in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and it was very grassroots, it was very disorganized, it became organized later on. How can the Democratic Party take some of the energy that was there and make it more organized the way that the Republicans do on the ground? And is that something they're really trying to do, or are they just, trying to focus on where their main votes are always coming from?
I don't think Congressman Kirk will help you with that answer, but
in a macro sense, I don't think we are, as they say, framing the issues properly where people can understand them and join us and be a part of it. That is, the leadership of our party is in Washington. They're inside the Beltway. They think everything in terms of inside the Beltway. And we're not understanding that people don't talk our language outside. I mean, the whole Democratic strategy right now is defeating the previous question. Now, only Mark Kirk knows what I'm talking about.
I do.
That is, we debate on whether that we should put our motion on the floor or not. Now, who the hell is watching? Maybe you guys are watching C-SPAN, but nobody else. So if that's the way we're trying to get our issues out. If I shouldn't say it. If I had my way, and I've tried to do it in my caucus, I mean, all 203 of us should be down in New Orleans. We are letting that city die. I mean, there is no question about it, and that's not what we should be doing. How do we do that? Debate it on the House floor where the rules are controlled by the majority. The rules change for anything. I mean, they have a rules committee which changes the rules. How do Newt Gingrich understood you don't play by the rules in that kind of situation because they keep changing the rules. You may as well just throw out the Monopoly game and leave, So we should be changing the rules. We're playing on their turf. And Newt figured out how to do that. He was a genius at that. We could figure out how to do that. But we're not. We're debating. We get a half hour on the biggest bills in the history of mankind, and we debate them for a half hour, and we lose. And that's how the press says, well, they lost the vote, 195 to 223, and that's it. But we didn't do anything to illustrate what our position was beside that oral debate. That will not win us the passion of the grassroots. We got to get out there visibly, I think, illustrating what we mean when I say we're all in this together.
I would add
I give you no party. No, the party organizations. I think the Democratic organization was not as bad as you think, and the Republican organization was not as good as you think. When we look at 2004 afterwards, and all sat down and said, "Oh gosh, how did the president win?" We saw that 8 million additional people voted for him, and the initial analysis showed that we knew were 4 million. People. It was some of the Protestant evangelical vote that had stayed home in 2000. 4 million additional votes from that community turned out. We all sat around the table and said, where did the other 4 million come from? And after intense analysis, part of the other 4 million was married women with children in cities within sight of a tall building. And so it just reflected a rough common sense.
Well, he's right that the Democrats in 2004 also they ACT through ACT and their various 527s turned out a tremendous number of people over 2000. But ACT isn't around. Did you work for ACT or did you work for the party?
It was just independent people who were later brought into the fold by the party.
Right. In theory, it would be you've got 2 Senate races, right? New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So in theory, those structures should be up and running, and the national committee. But my guess would be move on will be the one that ultimately pulls everybody together. It's unclear how the Democrats are going to pull it off.
One of the things that strikes me about the Democrats has been that, to go back to something Ted said earlier today, they are a coalition, and the coalition quite often is abrasive within, as also against the Republicans. Let me tell you a story. Bob Casey is running for the Senate in Pennsylvania against Rick Santorum. Santorum is considered to be one of the weaker Republican senators, and so on. There is a movement in Pennsylvania, or at least expression in Pennsylvania, from certain Democrats not to vote for Casey, who is a very popular guy, is the son of a former governor. Why not? I'll give the usual prizes and grades to anyone who could tell me why Democrats wouldn't vote for Bob Casey. Because he's against abortion. And there is a single issue mentality among many Democrats, as there is among many Republicans, and you see it coming out like this. Of all things, Hillary Clinton is now beginning to develop an antagonistic group who are saying they're going to run in the primary against her or not vote for her. Why? Because she's too friendly with Republicans. She actually went to a Mark Kirk cocktail party, I think.
She's from Park Ridge. She's a Cubs fan, or she used to be.
The sense, one of the things that you should not walk away with here is that when you're talking about the Democrats, you're not necessarily talking about a party. You're talking about a faculty. The Cornell faculty has never agreed on anything in its whole life, but they've talked about it, and will cut each other up on this sort of thing. It comes out every once in a while, particularly when you got a good chance to win. Do something to shoot yourself in the foot, I don't know how you handle that. There interesting speculation as to what the source of it is. But the kind of single issue mentality that says, you do it my way or I ain't playing, is very strong, certainly among Northeastern Democrats, in places like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania.
You remind me of Will Rogers saying, I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat. We have time for one more question.
I had a 3-part question.
Oh, wow.
Let's keep it to one.
Yesterday, I was reminded by Representatives Meeks and Ryan in a special session that the debt ceiling had just been lifted to $9 trillion. And I was wondering, part one of this question is, why that's not a central theme of the Democratic Party in this upcoming election. And part two of the question is, why my good friend who's well-educated and lives in the western suburbs of Chicago tells me that, and he's a Republican, tells me that the debt doesn't matter anymore. And how does this $9 trillion debt impact the future of American politics and policies?
There you go, man.
Yes. All right. That was a good answer. I think what it really comes down to, are the American people going to get excited again about the deficit and really do what they did in '92 and make that a central issue, or is it the fact that the war is costing so much and the natural disasters and so on that they just do not really get upset anymore about running a deficit?
I mean, once you get above, I don't know, a billion or trillion. Nobody knows. Yeah, nobody knows what you're talking. I mean, it's $9,000 billion. I mean, nobody knows what it means. We seem to be going every day. And the Republican Party, these fiscal conservatives and solid people, couldn't possibly be leading this economy into disaster in the long run. I mean, they don't. And it's when the Democrats create it, government is too big. When the Republicans, it's okay. And Bush has managed to say, it's the war and, we got and terrorism. They have used the 9/11 for every excuse for everything they wanted to do. But he's managed to convince people, I would say fool people, to that it was necessary to fight terrorism and to deal with the war in Iraq. I mean, and most people, we seem to be. I mean, this is going to be a terrible drag on the economy at some point. And I mean, the Democrats keep talking about fiscal responsibility. Nobody sees us as the party of fiscal responsibility, but we keep talking about it. They've created the biggest debt in the history of mankind. I have a PhD in history, so I can say that. And they don't take any. It's Teflon for them because somehow they're more established. I don't know. I don't understand it, frankly, that they haven't paid a price for this. I mean, this is incredible for what we have done as a nation, and who's going to end up paying for it.
Well, as we say on the Hill, let's take this one across the hall. We've got a reception across the hall in the Moynihan Room. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
All right. Go Big Red.
Go Big Blue.
Go Big Blue. That's right.
I just got over a cold about a week or so ago.